Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. Today we begin something new in Conversing, which is going to be a periodic series all around issues of artificial intelligence. It's a topic that is affecting our lives every day, whether we're conscious of it or not, whether we're aware of it, or whether we sit in fearful corners reading dark and depressing articles about just how it's going to take over the world. There is a spectrum of reaction to AI, and all of us are going to be affected by it. It seemed right to take that as a single topic and ask a number of different people who approach the topic from inside the computer science part of this, inside the philosophical side of this, inside the ethical side of this, inside the theological side of this, people who are trying to ask serious questions about a form of technology, a form of knowledge, a form of intelligence that is actively present already in our lives and will only become more so. Today, we have the opportunity to begin with hearing from Mark Graves. Mark is a research fellow and also a director of artificial intelligence, or AI, and faith, an organization based in Seattle. And he's also a research associate professor of psychology at Fuller Seminary. His work has really brought together all of the technological side of AI alongside moral and philosophical and religious questions as well. And he focuses in part really on health-related issues of AI. Mark, welcome. It is such an honor to have you.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here. Great to be able to have this conversation with you. I'm looking forward to it.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Not everyone that has religious interests necessarily has AI interests or AI capacities, and you have wedded these two things together. So tell us the story of how that emerged and how you hold them together, just as our starting point as we begin.
Sure, Mark. I grew up in East Tennessee in the Bible Belt. Grew up in a Southern Baptist church. It was what would be considered a pretty progressive Baptist church. Now it was affiliated with a college town. It turned out that I actually had one of my mom's relatives was an early researcher in artificial intelligence. So I was learning about AI.
Amazing.
He was involved in some of the early Bible translation work. So I was hearing about AI, even when I was in middle school, and it just kind of stuck with me as something I was interested in, or at least a direction. So I pursued, AI, computer science, all the way through, undergraduate and graduate school. And then as I was moving around for work and graduate school and work, then ended up attending different denominations and ended up, having to just find ways to reconcile, my faith and, scientific work, personally. I moved out to California. It's been close to 25 years ago. And out here I started doing that a little bit more public. I got a master's at the Graduate Theological Union here, working at the Center for Theology and Natural Science and at the Jesuit School of Theology. I ended up teaching science and religion for a few years. Came down to Fuller, where I got involved in the psychology program there, working with Moore and Brown on a project on looking at care and compassion and the moral psychology of that. It was there that I really thought I might be able to integrate not just kind of science and religion, but specifically looking at AI and kind of diving into some of the moral and ethical issues around that. I spent some more time, kind of working in, a startup company in San Francisco to strengthen my technical skills since I'd been in academia for a little while. Spent a couple of years at the University of Notre Dame studying and, doing a fellowship in moral psychology and moral theology. Then more time, in industry, kind of trying to build up some of the AI skills and also looking for real practical applications for some of the ethics. That's what took me into healthcare. It was just easier to find, ethical applications in healthcare than in some of the other, business areas. For the last, year and a half, I've been working at AI and Faith, which is a group of experts out of Seattle. There's almost 150 of us now that are looking at the issues at the intersection of AI and faith, both people with AI background that have a faith commitments that they want to bring into the work, as well as people in with theological training that are interested in AI, such as technology ethics.
It's such a rich background, and I can't imagine on the planet that there's just a lot of people who bring that combination as thoroughly together as you do. So it gives me a particular delight. And David Brenner, who was one of the founders, of course, of AI and Faith, is another guest on Conversing that has also been, of course, exploring these issues and is part of the occasional series that we're doing on AI and faith in our own terms within this podcast of Conversing. So thank you for sharing that background. So when you were coming into the AI world more and more professionally and academically, and eventually got your PhD from Michigan and understood the issues that are really critical on the technological side, give us a little bit more of the psychological process that you were facing as you yourself even faced the meaning and significance of the technology. What is that part of the biography?
Yeah, so when I was first studying AI, that was kind of at the middle and end of like a prior AI boom. And I guess I would characterize it most simply as just, it seemed like a lot of the research was philosophically naive, that people had intuitions about how the brain worked that were not informed as well from philosophy as I later studied in studying theology. And so it was very simple approach of how do you take these representations in the computer and then map them to the real world. And that to me seemed like a fundamental issue, was how do you do that connection between the two. And so that was actually the kind of the focus of my dissertation work at Michigan. And one of the representation frameworks that I ended up developing at that turned out coincidentally to actually be very good at mapping genome maps. And so I ended up being one of the first computer scientists to work on the genome project.
Oh, wow.
And kind of followed that for a while. And so the flip side of that was, the biology at the time especially was in a transition from kind of more I was called modern biology, but still kind of more of a pre-genomic and a post-genomic era. And so it was very messy, just a lot of older theories that people knew weren't valid and not very many new theories that had yet usurped them. And so kind of being from that kind of very logical approach to AI to a very, chaotic domain, kind of it stretched me. For me, I went from, a PhD student in math and engineering to becoming a lot more in touch with how I was feeling about things, how I was going to discern, kind of what would be my call. I spent some time. I was doing this in Texas at Baylor College of Medicine, and the church I ended up doing there was actually a Pentecostal Baptist church. It was a very eclectic group. And so, again, I felt like there was a period of years there where I just, kind of went deeper and deeper into my faith life. At the same time, kind of following that through the kind of more professional life. And so as I was getting deeper and deeper, I realized more and more about how the framework that I was using for AI just was not adequate at all. At the same time, these other experiences and then the theological training on top of that kind of gave me a framework. I'm like, well, all right, this addresses, this issue, and this could address that issue.
Yes.
And so it was happening at a couple of different levels.
So in a certain way, you were doing genomic mapping and theological mapping onto each other in various ways. Were there moments that you remember that were particularly for you the moments where it feels like the universe drops out, or you suddenly feel like you're experiencing vertigo because of the power of AI and its speedy unfolding?
Not so much. Not at that. Not earlier. I mean, I think the feeling around AI at the time was, we could build these systems, but then there was just a cliff.
Yes.
We'd build these complex, systems, and then, in the, deep at the kind of the bowels of it, there'd be, it would be star person star, and that would just be a placeholder for like all of humanity. And we could do some pretty interesting things, but, there just was not that connection. And so I think for me and other people, it was a little bit more kind of a progressive disillusionment.
And it was a disillusionment of what, would you say?
Of the theories that we had at the time.
Yes, got it.
To capture.
Right.
Though, as soon after that, as I started moving into biology and thinking about how do you represent that messiness, trying to figure out how to represent that, then helped me understand ways in which could actually be representing, more complex things. And then, like in parallel, as the web was developing and expanding, and there were new techniques that were more statistical rather than symbolic, which, I mean, I had learned of, some of those even back in grad school, but we just didn't have the compute power to do it, or the data to do anything with those.
Right. I just want to pause for a moment and just say, what's fascinating to me about what you've just said is that it's just the story of a literal unfolding reality and science and technology that's all literally happening as you yourself are emerging and developing, both as a young person in the world, but also later as a graduate student, now as a professional that's bringing these things together. And in that very arc and period, the field of AI and the field of genomics and the field of how these things and so much else in the world is changing was the story of your own personal development during that period. I just think it's worth just pausing and just acknowledging how substantial that is.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the insights I gained from being in kind of the middle of the genome project, where people were concerned that like departments would disappear, or, what's going to happen to the field, was that like at the middle of like this historic event, people were just confused. And that kind of gave me some insight into other like major events, in that if you're in the middle of it, you don't have the framework that then gets developed later. It was like we're doing stuff. I mean, the whole time I was at Houston, what I was doing, I mean, it was a researcher, but the whole area I worked in just lacked a name. It was one of the last publications I did where, I said, well, we've got to give this role a name. Let's call it bioinformatician. And I remember like a conversation at lunch at a conference where I mentioned that and asked what other people were doing. And another person said, well, I call it, informaticist, bioinformaticist. That seems like more, of a standard route. And somebody else said, well, but I like that mix, kind of German informatic, and more of a French,
Yes.
And so it's like, okay. And I still, today see both of those terms, but I remember those years where we didn't even have those terms to describe what we were doing.
Right.
And that helps me, like, while I'm working in AI, and especially this AI and theology, which even 5 years ago, there was like, what connection is there? What's weight is the and doing?
Yes. Yeah.
We may not know, and it may be longer than a couple of years. It could be, a couple of decades even before we really understand what's there, at that intersection.
Right. So in a way, you're continuing that sort of unknowing as part of the very work that you're doing, where the structure is being created. It literally is like living inside a plane being built while you're flying it sort of experience.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of, that, building the plane as we're going, that's a common metaphor to use here in the Bay Area for some startup companies. And I mean, and there's a grain of truth at it. But I mean, there's a part of me that also sees, well, yeah, but that's not quite the same as when you're dealing also with a realm like theology, which itself is completely full of unknowns.
Right. Yeah. It's a remarkable combination. You're clearly a person who does well in ambiguous spaces. but yet your work is working continuously toward clarity.
Yeah, I think part of, you were asking about the psychology before. It's like, I mean, I think part of it is I don't necessarily like that ambiguity, but I've now spent enough of my life working in those kind of spaces that I can hang in there long enough to try and make it less ambiguous.
Right. So going back to your phrase about AI and faith, what kind of weight are you giving to the and? Tell us where you are in your thinking about it now. How would you say today the connection between AI and faith exists and interacts?
Yeah, I've ended up kind of within the projects, especially over the few years, some of them have started very much with the AI and kind of, oriented toward the faith, typically around ethics. A lot of it in kind of healthcare ethics, data science, very applied, ethics, projects. And then on the other end, it's been, kind of thinking about it more in terms of systematic and philosophical theology. What are the issues like around the person that need to be addressed? Or, what does morality or virtue, look like? Not necessarily just in certainly future AI, not current AI, but in future AI, but also the interactions between humans and AI that could, plausibly happen over the next several years. And then there's kind of how do I bridge that? And so, there it's looking at, philosophical theories around community and how you build community and, interpretation and language and how humans and AI might communicate. And as I would kind of go between those three different areas, then sometimes just for time management reasons, I would need to kind of try and pull them a little bit further together. And so for me, that's kind of what's in that and space is kind of starting from the AI and moving toward the faith and faith toward AI and then thinking about the bridge. And it's not a cohesive whole yet, but it's to where I can start to see ways in which they support each other.
Yes. One of the things that I think for average observers of AI and people being affected by AI consciously or not is the way that it can impinge on our understanding of what it means to be human and about human capacity, human mindfulness, intelligence, the meaning of intelligence related to AI, that whole cluster of things. Tell us about what you think is important work that's going on in that area and how your questions of faith interact with that domain, that sensitivity and sensibility about what it means to be human.
I think it's a kind of a complex question because people seem to approach it themselves from multiple perspectives.
Yes, right.
So sometimes, I'll know someone who's doing amazing work in neuroscience, but then you ask them bigger questions about personhood, and it doesn't sound like it really developed that much since they were in high school.
Right.
Or talk to philosophers that are deep into some established philosophical approach to the human person, but then that's for example that doesn't take technology into account, even though they probably spend 8 to 10 hours a day engaging with technology, use calendars, word processors, etc., and couldn't even conceive of doing their work without a heavy dependence upon technology.
Right.
And so I think there's some kind of, for people, it can be tough to actually kind of bring that together themselves. And I mean, as someone who's going down that path, it really is, even just to switch between them, sometimes. But I think there's, aspects. So for example, one of the questions that I've seen come up is does AI have a soul? And so, if you take kind of a traditional religious perspective, well then, No, I mean, how could it? It's not even worth reflecting upon. But then, like, as you unpack it, it's like, well, I mean, so what does, if you look at historically what the terms meant, there's a philosophical foundation that goes back to, Aristotle and Plato about form and, what the essence of something is. Well, that's very close to what we mean by information now. And so if you unpack that, it's like, well, this kind of the information processing of AI is actually pretty close to what was originally meant by soul. And from all we understand about the human condition and the way the brain works, and what was traditionally ascribed to soul and is now kind of sliced off into mind and body, then all of a sudden, what is the soul? What is it? Is it just that there's some continuity, or like Nancy Murphy talks about memory, continuing.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden it gets into depending upon the position you take, I mean, you can believe that people have souls, but you need to say what that means. And if you look at it historically, well, AI almost certainly has soul. Now, the soul that AI has, it's not permanent. You can just turn it off. So it's not what was meant. It doesn't outlast death like a lot of the historical, views were, or, Christian, beliefs. But that soul piece of it, that kind of philosophical core that was used by theologians over centuries to understand it, AI is actually a pretty good model for that. We think about artificial intelligence as, mind, but as it's embedded within robotics and interacting in the world and interacting with us socially in a variety of ways, it goes a little bit more than what we mean just by being intelligent. It's a social and potentially moral actor. And so I think some of the questions, it challenges our understanding of personhood at multiple levels, because it's not just that kind of initial, hey, this is what we think a person would mean, but even when you go, fairly deep philosophically, it also questions it. We just haven't really had an opportunity to think about another entity, not necessarily species, but another entity that has some of the skills. And I think what happened kind of a year ago with the ChatGPT is, AI was doing some interesting things with robotics and vision, but what it was doing with language, even though some of that work had been around for a while, really kind of hit kind of the public awareness.
Right.
It's like, hey, I can actually communicate. I can ask questions. I get response. That it was interesting that, up until a year ago, there's all these questions about the Turing test and could you tell whether an AI is a person or not? And kind of a year ago, it became kind of the question in academia, hey, how can I tell, the difference between an AI and what an undergraduate, is going to write for an essay? And so it's not just, it kind of came in as like an average college student. It's where it can kind of communicate. And that's a surprisingly high bar, given where the technology had been 5 years before,
Yes.
where it could, barely generate complete sentences to, that kind of exposition. And so I think that does challenge that part of the person where a lot of the way we interact is through communication. It is, the language that we use.
Yes.
And so if AI is interacting at that level, then even if there's not a lot of the other things that make us human, one of the things that we had seen differentiated us from other animals is that ability to communicate. And all of a sudden, here was this, artifact that's actually doing that. So what's left, for kind of human uniqueness or exceptionalism?
Yes, yes. So pressing on that just a bit further, so you would be comfortable, I am assuming then, that the way some people are describing AI is literally a new intelligence. Would you use that phrase yourself, or would you feel like that's too problematic?
Well, I wouldn't use the phrase new intelligence because I think that just puts a lot of weight on intelligence. Like, I'm comfortable with AI, it's an established field. Nobody has a great definition, but there's at least a kind of a sociological processes around that. But I think the intelligence, I mean, that's narrow even from a human psychological perspective. It's there for, I mean, it's useful in looking at populations and maybe even some comparisons, but it doesn't mean anything. The intelligence tests are there, they're correlated with what we think is intelligence, but we don't actually, in a sense, we measure proxies of intelligence.
Yes.
And
yes.
so, like, I feel like it's just not that useful of a construct, even for people, to then put the extra weight on of saying, hey, we've got it new. But I do understand that people do sometimes use that as a proxy for cognition and thinking and even motivations and emotional processing. And then that kind of broader sense, then, yeah, I do think we're coming up with something new. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think the reason why I bring it up is that some of the articles and books that I've been reading about AI suggest that a lot of the greatest speculation, the greatest hope, and the greatest anxiety seems to turn around this question of an understanding. It could just be information, as you say, but intelligence has often been the word that I've seen used to describe a matter of something like a perception and analysis that brings about decision makings in the far reaches of what technology can actually provide in a way that humans can't, in which people that are doing the system building themselves don't really understand why AI works the way that it does. So it ends up feeling as though there is this entity that is doing work, which ends up producing something like what we traditionally call some kind of intelligence, in which there's a capacity for perception and something like understanding, something like, therefore, discernment might be a little too speculative, but something like an assessment in which there's prioritization and decisions made by AI, which we don't understand. So interact with that cluster and the anxiety that that creates for people.
Yeah, I think I'm going to split it up in a couple of different ways.
Sure.
Because I think there's the anxiety, like with the developers not fully understanding, where, part of that's just because of the complexity. I mentioned earlier, like as a graduate student, like when I worked with an AI system, it might have, 50,000 lines of code, but I could still look at any of one of them and say, hey, this one line here is not sufficient to represent humanity. Whereas with the models now, especially like the foundation models, there are literally tens, if not hundreds of billions of parameters that are part of the model. And so no one person can look at that to even say, well, all right, it's not here, it's not there. And so just the size of it is just more than we can understand. So I think there's also a piece of it where you can reduce it. It's like, well, I understand the processing that's happening at this one, parameter, and it's scaled billions of times, but I still understand this one. And so, I understand that there's not really anything there, and that justifies my belief that there's not really anything to AI. It's just some, complex mathematics, and it's not human in any sense. But I think between those two is that whenever you've got tens or hundreds of billions of something interacting, then you get these emergent phenomena.
Yes.
And that's what people are interacting with. And no one understands what's happening through emergence in AI, even though it's relatively simple now. But I think the flip side of that is we're just, a few billion neurons in our brain and, maybe 100 times that in our body. And they interact in ways that, are not completely understood. But we have a lot of understanding of what's happening at the cellular level that somehow seems to emerge. And so I think there's a parallel there between what's happening. There are some simple processes. We've got a whole lot of them with over time and a lot of complex, either data or experience. And that there is where you end up with the complexity. And that's what's going to continue to grow. And so I think there's known unknowns of, well, how are these models working? And, how do you understand how they're interacting? That it may, certainly at the cutting edge, at most a handful of people understand. And at this point, I feel like no one really understands it all, because even if you're a world expert in like language models, you might not know a lot about computer vision or robotics. I think we've passed the point where you could have experts of all of what we would consider AI. And that's that kind of known unknown, but it's also the kind of thing that I imagine 10 years from now will be well explained in some textbook. But then I think there are these more of the unknown unknowns where the anxiety is like, what direction are we headed? Are we going to end up with government regulation that shuts down stuff so much that AI never really gets much beyond where it is now? Or are we going to end up with, some rogue scientist somewhere that pulls together a lot of different pieces and then unleashes it and creates a relatively simple AI computer virus that shuts down all of technology that we have now, and maybe not sends us back into the Stone Age, but really requires a hard reset going back a few decades or something like that.
Right.
Both of those are plausible, and then a whole lot of places in between. And so I think there's just such a range there that, to me, anxiety is a normal human response to that much uncertainty, and not that far into the future.
I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing. We're recording this conversation at a time when the film Oppenheimer has been out only for about a week. And it's brought back to mind for many people, I think, the awareness of an emerging technology, in that case, the study of physics and fusion and fission that ends up creating an instrument that is so profoundly destructive. The arguments go on back and forth about whether it should have been used at all, whether one bomb would have been enough, whether you had to drop two. There was the anxiety that the film captures about Oppenheimer's own concerns about whether a nuclear explosion like this would actually somehow ignite the whole atmosphere of the Earth and possibly, fry the whole planet. There's various ways that people have interpreted this history, but watching all that in this moment and thinking about issues of AI, you can't help but think we're in this moment where something is really truly unfolding. It actually is being made every day and every moment of every day, 24 hours a day around the world, and certainly in a much faster way than could ever have been done humanly, by the way that machines themselves are generative, et cetera, et cetera. So this anxiety that I think is a real anxiety, whatever one thinks about the potential value and benefit of AI, there is this feeling that there's a new entity alive, quote unquote, in the world that is increasingly, it seems, independent, increasingly creative and generative in that way, and increasingly affecting things that we don't see and can't manage in any way parallel to anything we've experienced up to now. So this is where your work in ethics, it seems to me, becomes so important. So why don't you ground it in some kind of ethical issue that you think is a good exemplar of what the ethics of AI actually ends up meaning when you're working on that. It's not just an idea. It actually really is meant to be something that shapes, and I think you have argued in things that I've heard you say it and write, that you would hope for an AI system that is an ethical AI. So describe what that even means. It sounds mind-bending again, but really important.
Yeah, I think part of it is, the complexity of AI systems is so large, and it's going to continue, that at some point we're going to need, we already do need AI to help us monitor AI. And so as that continues, then I feel like that's a place to kind of target the AI, is that as we're building systems, I mean, there's kind of the human component. And so as we're building a system, we're using, for example, a medical system, we're using people's data, and we're thinking about building a system to, help recommend interventions for a doctor, to consider. So not just a diagnosis, but maybe if they've got a diagnosis, what are some things that could be tried? And it's easy for, the people doing that work to focus on like, well, what's going on with this person that I've got data for? And it's hard to go through that and look at the kind of the foundation of that. Kind of one of the classic examples is, a few years ago, somebody was building a system that was trying to figure out who needed an earlier intervention, And they had a lot of historical data, and the way they were looking at how sick a person was how much was the healthcare costing. And I can understand how that would make sense, but one of the things that they just did not take into account is that not everybody has the same healthcare access. And so the people that had the best healthcare access were spending more than people that didn't have that same level of access insurance, but that were much sicker. And so it turned out, even though they had known enough to look for things like racial disparity in the prediction, they didn't have the data to look underneath that to see that people that were disadvantaged actually were being treated unfairly, by the system. And it just requires a lot of training to learn to see that in especially systems that have never been built before. So that's kind of the human ethical piece.
Yes.
But then, as you scale that up, not like what 5 years ago was maybe one or two people at a company trying to do something new with AI, but now you've got, major enterprises that have, tens or thousands of people all working on these AI products that are then going to be interacting in the system. Even though there are careful ways to help determine if something is really causing a lot of harm, there's going to be all these kind of emergent interactions that are just going to be too complex to trace. And we can regulate what might go into that pool, but we're going to need more and more sophisticated tools in order to kind of track down where some inequities are coming from, or what it is that's causing harm, or even who's being harmed. And so if, for example, we're in a future where everybody's, even if you call a customer care center, you're talking with an AI, then there just aren't people that are going to actually hear unless somebody goes in and looks at the data. And so I think that's a place where the AI can really be targeted. And I think that also addresses some of the concerns of, well, hey, even if we try and make, everything, if we try and make our AI responsible in the US, well, who knows what's going to happen in other countries? We need to make our AI as responsible as we can, but we also need to be building AI that can interact with, monitor, and advise about any AI that we're interacting with.
It is, as you're saying, obviously so many layers. And I think about the anger that our culture carries, it seems, all the time right now with the level of technology that's already in our system. I'm just thinking about the commonness of people talking about being stuck forever on a call waiting process, trying to get somebody to answer a business-related question. I was recently doing some banking and again got caught in one of those feedback loops that felt like it took half my day and wasted it. And then recently was doing another task and I realized that I was going to several websites now after I discovered this experience. Then I started going to several websites to see if I was seeing the same thing, which was that there was no non-technological way of reaching out. It was only a computer. And even that was pretty hard to discover sometimes. And it was more like there were no phone numbers. There was no chance of having a contact person. If there was a contact person, it was a ChatGPT entity. And depending on the thing you're talking to someone about, the level of what I was doing was nothing, but the level of imagining taking a real crisis to a moment like that, where you feel as though something is desperately vulnerable and the that the entities that are controlling the world through AI are making themselves impenetrable to human contact, that'll be creating some pretty, I think, significant social psychology issues, which we already have, but which will only become, I think, much more escalated.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think in a certain way it's even worse, because even if you do get a hold of a person, then that could be a person in a call center sitting in front of a computer whose only options are there on the screen.
Yes, right.
And so even if there's the appearance of the human interaction, then it may still be controlled by, algorithms. I mean, I think we're already there. I mean, call Uber or Lyft, if you're in an urban environment, or you order something from Amazon that's then, fulfilled in a warehouse. If in a sense, like the algorithm doesn't like you, there's nothing anyone can do about it. I mean, now, why it might not like you is, there could be a bug, it could be something, but it would be hard to even discover, what that is, where it's coming from, even if your direct interactions are with people. And I think that's one of the things that, when I talk about AI, especially with people that are trained in philosophy and ethics, is to think about AI as like a program on a computer that's just really, really complex. But like day-to-day working with it, I would work on systems that could be spread over multiple data centers, over multiple states that are interacting, sending messages back and forth. And I have no idea what part of, even processes that I'm very involved with are being done automatically or being done by a person. Because sometimes things that you would think would be done automatically, you go through, and then what happens is a engineer gets a email, in the night that they have to go in and make a few changes, because from a product perspective, it's a lot easier to have an engineer spend half an hour doing that manually, every day, than it would have been to have 20 engineers spend 6 months trying to build something that would handle those edge cases. On the other hand, you could have something that you think a person is doing, and maybe an engineer did it, a few hundred times, and they got tired of doing it, so they just wrote a script to do it. And most of the company could think that's still what they're doing, but all it is just, they just check it and make sure it ran automatically.
Yes.
And so those are edge cases, but there really is. Within these processes, it can be hard to tell what's actually being done by a person and what's actually being done by a machine.
Right. I think all this is going to cause existentialism to have a revival because there's a sense that it just exactly as the seedbed of existentialism itself emerged out of a technology anxiety and a sense of manipulation and a despair about the individual agent. I remember once dealing with an entity that kept sending me a bill that said that I owed $0.00. And I wrote to them several times saying, I'm done. You can close the account. There was no way at the time to be able to do it otherwise than calling. I never got a person. I would leave the message. I'd say, please cancel, please cancel. I'd write another note. Eventually, I decided to participate in the system. So I sent the business a check for $0.00. And sure enough, it immediately cleared it all up. I never got another bill from them again, right? But that kind of a moment becomes an icon of this feeling that you are caught up in systems that are shaping your life, that in that case, in a silly way that I could have just disregarded. But for whatever reason, right, it tags into you, it hooks into you in a certain way and makes it feel like surely this is a problem that should be able to be solved. Well, if it's really about something that matters at a really significant level under pressure of time and medical emergency or health or ethics or the justice of shared resources, those are just enormously complicated and important challenges to take on and can leave the individual, even a community of people, particularly for the reasons of bias that can be built into systems, blind to a whole population that is simply literally unseen, non-existent to the entity. And while I agree that certainly it's the case that there's limited choices at a call center, it's also the case that at least you can tell a real person that that's what's going on.
Right. Well, and I think that's true. I mean, like just the empathy of,
Right.
being able to have somebody that can, understand and appreciate the frustration that you're feeling. Yeah. I mean, one of the projects that I've worked on is actually like looking at like call center logs to try and see what emerging trends are occurring, and I mean, people call in. I mean, so there are ways of looking at it, but there's also, I mean, like those were specific projects that somebody wanted and somebody drove to actually find, and companies may not. They may not care about that.
Right.
They may not actually be able to. I know some, large healthcare companies that may have grown by acquiring hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller companies. Those systems sometimes just don't talk to each other.
Right.
There might not be a person that can fix it.
Well, I'm particularly struck by the work that you're doing in healthcare related things because, for example, I remember once speaking to the deans of a medical school about the meaning of developing and forming people who were, quote, the good physician. And there was a huge division in this medical school between the side of the faculty that really believed that they were in the business of treating persons. And then there were another group of people who were, on the whole, organic chemists who really believed that they were not treating persons. They were really just treating biological activity. And that really the idea of developing a good doctor was only to develop a scientist who could manage the biology, not a good physician who cared for the whole person or cared for the person, that it was a person that was being involved in this, let alone caring for the whole person. So if you take AI and introduce it into that equation and then say it's really splintering off into these two areas where it's just biology, you want the biology, you want the science, you want the benefit of all of the insight and knowledge and his history and background and everything that can bring. And it still matters, I would argue, that we are treating persons and that the ability to make that bridge, that final bridge, but to trust the severe technology, I'll call it, only without the absence of the good physician, then feels like it exposes at least one way into the problem of how AI interacts with healthcare.
Yeah. And I think my concerns in situations like that are actually probably a little bit more about the people than the technology.
Yes.
Even though obviously a lot of people that go into healthcare are really going in it, because they care. The systems can sometimes be set up where it doesn't matter what your personal motivation is. You may be really limited in what your options are.
Yes.
And I think AI can certainly exacerbate that. But I do see a way in which AI can help kind of, in a sense, create some of those bridges if people are so inclined.
Yes. Yes.
One of going kind of back to like ChatGPT, I think it's also interesting, not only is it able to function as, an average college student, it's able to do that across a huge number of areas.
Yes. Yes.
So especially more recent versions, that have modules to help with the math, and then you've got questions about organic chemistry, and then you've got questions about sociology, and the philosophical ethics. It has that foundation, and so there are ways in which I think we can use the kind of AI, even though it is biased, even though it can conflagrate, that it can actually help people kind of broaden their perspective. So, for example, if you were one of the person-oriented physicians there, and and one of the organic chemists is kind of like proposing, hey, well, we can't add a course in, I guess I want to say spirituality, not necessarily what you and I would mean by spirituality, but that kind of more psycho-spiritual piece.
Yes.
But, instead we need to give them more neuropharmacology or something like that. Well, then I'm imagining that person could use AI to say, hey, well, what about this research that shows that some of these other more social spiritual factors impact things like longevity by 1.5 to 2 years? How do we address that? And so it pushes it into that more kind of quantitative, in that case, epidemiological space. And then what about these studies that are that show that how, neurotransmitters are affected by this close personal contact, even holding someone's hand. And so all of a sudden, so that's a place I think technology, AI could help kind of create those bridges, because I think as people, we do typically become very siloed and specialized in order to, participate in some of these, complex systems and decision making.
Right. So let's close with one final question I wanted to ask you about. Going back again to the ordinary observer, non-AI, directly involved person who simply exists in the world, is aware of AI, knows that it's shaping their lives, reads headlines about major CEOs of major AI enterprises stepping entirely away from AI with warnings that they're stepping down really because of the dangers of AI. How do you calibrate that as a person that's much more inside all of this than I, or probably many of the people that are listening to this conversation?
Yeah, I think some of that can just be like a legitimate fear that you don't want to be put in like Oppenheimer's position,
Right.
Especially if it goes poorly. And, in a high stress job that, where you have the freedom and luxury to step away. I think for some people, that's it. I can imagine me if I had continued just with the computer science, moved out in the Bay Area as kind of the, tech boom was starting, and stayed within that for 20 years. I could see myself in that position. It's like, right. What am I creating? But I think there are ways in which you can participate in conversations, like this, drawing upon the insights of people that, have different specialties. I'm amazed, even in talking with people in technology that are doing what might be considered from the outside like ethics, responsible AI, addressing health equity and fairness, how unfamiliar they are with like literally centuries of ethical thought. And so I see kind of in parallel to what I saw in kind of the prior stage of AI, where people were trying to come up, that were using their own insights, to answer questions that had been well debated for decades among philosophers. I see people now trying to maybe this or this, issues that have been discussed, literally for centuries among, ethicists, both in religious and secular context. And so I think, part of it there is there's also a little bit of a cop-out. It's like, I built this, I'm now able to retire, and I hope you guys figure it out.
Not exactly the reassurance that most of us are looking for, but an understandable way of describing the experience of people on the ground. Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a great joy and honor. I'm really glad that you're connected to Fuller and that you're connected to AI and faith, which is a very, very important project. So keep it up, and thank you for this chance to converse. I'm looking forward to maybe following up in a couple of years and seeing where things are at that stage and how that conversation and this conversation might compare and contrast.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I've really enjoyed it. And I look forward to, continuing a conversation in the future.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they are released. And please leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.